Today we have an expert in that, Professor David Domke of the University of Washington, who's written 2 books in recent years on that very topic. Back in 2004, he wrote God Willing, Political Fundamentalism in the White House, the War on Terror, and the Echoing Press. And this fall, he has coming out a new book picking up on that theme and developing it further, The God Strategy, How Religion Became a Political Weapon in America. Welcome to Speaking of Freedom.
Thank you, Doug. It's good to be here.
And now your new book that's coming out has as its subtitle, How Religion Became a Political Weapon. Why do you pick the word weapon?
Well, if you look at religion and politics in America from the founding, there've always been a kind of a dynamic tension between the two. They've always been circling one another, and you know, even back to George Washington, there was invocations of God in speeches by political leaders. What has happened, the book shows, is that in the last 100 years, what we would call the modern presidency, there's been a tremendous shift in that span of time, really beginning in 1980, in which religion moved from kind of this abstract, kind of over a layer, what some scholars have called kind of an umbrella, what is known as the civil religion tradition, to a partisan use of religion, in which politicians, particularly presidential candidates and presidents, have begun to use religious to justify policies, to win votes, to persuade others to not vote for people. So it's been used in a much more divisive, confrontational, partisan manner in the last really 2.5 decades. And the book chronicles this shift beginning with Ronald Reagan through the last 4 presidents.
Okay, let's take off there. Now, I personally don't think of Ronald Reagan as a very religious man.
Well, Reagan today, to many people who may not like George W. Bush, looks like not a half bad guy. But Reagan actually ran on the heels of Jimmy Carter. Carter was elected in '76. And you know, devout Southern Baptist, evangelical, and the religious conservative movement that was beginning in this country, that you mentioned you mentioned the moral majority and others that were mobilizing, thought that Carter was going to be their man, but he wasn't. In the White House, he didn't support the policies they wanted. Recognizing this, Reagan in 1980 ran a campaign in which he distinctly reached out to the religious conservative movement that was just beginning, to Jerry Falwell and to others, and told them that he was their candidate. He went and spoke with them. There are a couple kind of famous moments, and he went and spoke with them and kind of reached out to them. And throughout his political career, he often presented the policies that they wanted, religious conservatives wanted. He didn't necessarily pursue them, but he presented them in religious terms, and that was enough for them at that time.
Was he somebody who personally went to church and had a background of involvement in religion like Carter did?
Well, see, this is where you get into the actual piety of the candidates means nothing. What we're talking about here is the public use of religion. So a candidate's own personal religious preferences really doesn't seem to matter. So you go back to, the book begins with Franklin Roosevelt. You can go back through Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, all the way through Kennedy up through George W. Bush. And there's a range of kind of religious beliefs, all Christian, but a range of kind of devotion within those candidates. Reagan and George W. Bush, who are kind of seen as the standard bearers of the religious right political candidates, almost never go to church, those two. So it's not about just distinctly how religious these candidates seem to be by going to church or reading the Bible or any of those kinds of things. It's about the policies that the candidates offer. And what conservatives have done more effectively than Democrats, or because they've wanted to more than Democrats have, is to offer the policies and use religion for that kind of partisan purposes, behind abortion, behind the opposition to gay marriage, and support of school prayer. In many ways, that if you look back to Roosevelt, to Truman, to Eisenhower, they did not do that. They did talk about God a little bit. That was there, but they weren't using it for justifying policies.
So how would they have talked about God in their political career?
Well, if you look at FDR, for example, he gave a speech, a famous speech on D-Day. It was a speech, it was a radio address, in which he issued a prayer from the White House. And he asked God to protect the U.S. troops, the Allied troops. And so if you don't believe in God, or if you're anti-religion to begin with, you're troubled by that already, right off the bat, right?
Right, of course.
But what he was doing, if you're open to the idea that God may be a genuine entity, and also that, you know, it's okay for a person to have faith, he wasn't in any way putting the stamp of God's approval upon this policy. He didn't say God wanted us to go on D-Day. What he was asking for was kind of a blessing a blessing. That's what he asked for on that day. So Roosevelt, many liberals want to look back at Roosevelt and say, gee, he would have done anything religious. But this is a prayer from the White House that was nationally broadcast on radio. The major difference that you see from something like that to what Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and George W. Bush have done, and even a little bit with Bill Clinton, is that they have much more consistently talked about, used religion to kind of put the stamp of approval on their policies, on what they've done. They haven't just asked God or this kind of supreme being to bless the nation or to protect the nation or the troops. They've actually many times, and we've documented this in the book, suggested and sometimes explicitly suggested that the policies they're pursuing are the ones that God wants. And anybody who disagrees with them doesn't just disagree with them, the politician, disagrees with God. And that just completely changes the political discussion.
Now, does that trouble you?
It troubles me tremendously. I'm a person of faith myself, and I feel like faith in general has been hijacked. It's been hijacked for political purposes. And it isn't just been done by conservatives, okay? It's been done, Bill Clinton did it fairly effectively in the 1990s. Now, I'm personally politically more comfortable with some of the things Clinton had to say, but the fact that he regularly invoked God, talked about religion and faith a tremendous amount, also, fits this trend from the post-1980s forward. So am I angered by it? I'm definitely not wanting it to continue, and I'm active in the public arena with trying to kind of get candidates to not pursue this line of argument. But that's almost a fruitless endeavor in the United States, where 90+% of Americans say they believe in God, and that statistic's been around for a long time. And we have some of the largest church-going or worship-going populations in the Western society. So what you more likely is to not try to eradicate religion or faith from American politics. It's not possible, and in my case, it's not really desirable. It's to move us away from a partisan use, away from using religion as a weapon for political purposes, away from saying that I'm right, you're wrong, which is more of a theological question, and putting that theology over the political ideology, which we've certainly seen with George W. Bush, but it didn't start with Bush.
Now, I think from the standpoint of the ACLU, the issue becomes more government sponsorship of religion.
Sure.
And it seems to me in the current Bush administration, right, it's been taken to a new height in terms of the so-called faith-based initiative, which isn't simply talking about religion to justify one's policy, but funneling money to religiously based organizations that can proselytize. What's your take on that?
Well, this is a great example of what happens after 2.5 decades of kind of this partisan use of religion. George Bush comes into the White House, and in his first week in the White House, he issues an executive order implementing these faith-based initiatives. It changes 200 years of government policy, which is to not fund religious organizations for social service or for any other services. He implements it, then Congress funds it. And as David Quo documents quite spectacularly in his book, Tempting Faith, he's a former leading member of the Office of Faith-Based Initiatives, and then became disillusioned about its political uses. The initiative has been overwhelmingly used for political and partisan purposes by the White House. They used it tremendously in 2004 to raise energy and support for George W. Bush. So I'm deeply troubled by the faith-based initiative on two levels. One is I don't want any religious organization doing the work of kind of government or other social service organizations, because inevitably the message that's going to come through them is going to be religiously tainted. Okay, they're going to use it for religious terms, and I don't think the government should be involved in that. Second, the reality is that the politics of all of this intermingles with the faith elements of these organizations that get the money, and it really is to the denigration of both entities. It hurts our government. It hurts those faith-based organizations that are trying to do what they believe is the right thing to do. I think keep them separate. You keep that wall of separation strong. That's been the genius of the United States, this wall of separation. What we've moved from is a wall of separation between church and state to what George W. Bush has called a bridge of integration between church and state.
Yeah, let's talk a little more about the history. You were telling me just before we started the show that there's a difference in the way the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution deals with God and religion.
Yeah, these are the two kind of founding documents of the United States, or of America. The Declaration of Independence in 1776, the Constitution is 1789. If you look at those two documents, in the first one, the Declaration, there's several references to God, and there's the famous reference that all men are created equal.